Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Latin America team's Facebook Live. Today we're discussing embattled presidents, and not actually President Trump, but the Brazilian president, Michel Temer, and President Nicolas Maduro, both of which are under extreme pressure. Temer with calls to resign, and Maduro actually something very similar. So let's turn here. I'm joined today by João de Castro Neves from our Brazil team. I'm Risa Grais-Targow. I lead our Venezuela coverage. And João, let's start with Brazil. It's been almost a week since these revelations about Temer emerged. Where are we in his in this scandal, and how's he looking these days?
Not good. I think that he's not looking that good, and I think that this scandal is just part of it's a chapter of what seems to be a very long book of crisis in Brazil. And basically now the president, who was until last week seen as the answer to the crisis, began to be seen now as actually the continuation of the crisis. So our view is that it's very low probability that he survives, right? We do see in a moment now of yet another transition in Brazil that will lead in a matter of a few months to a new president taking over.
So you said a few months. How does this play out? And I should add that if you're joining us and you do have questions, feel free to send them, and we'll do our best to address them. But give me a sense of how this actually plays out.
Well, there are several different paths, right? I mean, of course, when you talk about taking a president out, usually impeachment comes to mind. There are criminal actions that can be charged against him at the Supreme Court as well. But these are more protracted, hard to get through. Very conveniently, there is parallel to all this mess. There's a case standing at the Electoral Court on Rousseff's and Temer, the previous president, and Temer's ticket in the 2014 election, charging them with illegal campaign funding, right? It has nothing to do with this scandal of last week, but it's a very convenient way. It could be a safety valve to just remove him. The Electoral Court will resume its trial early next month in June, and we think that that's kind of the easiest way, barring a resignation, which could happen as well, but that's the easiest way to remove Temer. That can take several weeks to a few months.
Okay. And what does this mean for the reform agenda in the meantime? There was so much excitement, and especially among investors, about the fiscal reform agenda. The government seemed very close to clinching this pension reform deal. So what happens to that?
Well, without a doubt, I mean, there are delays, right? I mean, when it comes to the fiscal reforms, which is basically pension reform, which is kind of one of the holy grails of Brazil's fiscal agenda, that will not move before the crisis is resolved, right? We do expect when the crisis resolves that this agenda will come back on track. But, in other minor microeconomic and more specific reforms, those will move more slowly. But overall, we do have now the political crisis has come to the fore and kind of press the pause button on a lot of these reforms in Brazil over the next month or two until a new president is in place.
So we do have elections scheduled for next year. At what point are legislators going to start to think about elections over pension reform? What's the window here to actually enact reform?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we do think that what's driving the reforms now, even though they're unpopular, is kind of the invisible hand of fear, right? In the sense that the majority of the political class is afraid that no reform will bring the country to a state of permanent crisis and recession. I mean, remembering here that Brazil has had almost a lost decade in 3 years when it comes to growth, right? And I think that invisible hand of fear is driving the majority of the political class to back some of these reforms, however unpopular. But of course, as closer we get to the 2018 elections in October, that momentum will begin to fade away, maybe early next year. So the window, I think, will begin to close later this year. It's a very tight calendar. That's why this political crisis needs to be resolved quite quickly.
And so who actually takes over for Temer, and who is there at this point that isn't involved in a scandal and somehow tarnished in terms of the figures in Brazil's political class?
Well, that's a very good question, Risa. And I do think that, it's almost a game of last candidate standing, right? And there are not a lot now standing without any liability, political or legal liability. We do think that one call that remains from all of this that we've been kind of flagging for quite some time is that the anti-establishment sentiment in Brazil and other countries as well is growing stronger, and I think the scandal reinforces that, right? Basically a discredit of the political class. And when we do think that looking into next year, there will be a lot of surprises at the presidential election, meaning new names that may pop up, like the mayor of São Paulo, João from the PSDB, and other names as well. So it's going to be, a wide open landscape for surprises, right? And I think that, and the political class needs to respond to that. And so far, what we see is in Brazil that institutions seem to work. It's the political class that is not working very well, and that's going to be an issue in 2018. When I think, the same question to you now, I mean, with respect to Maduro as well, I think that, internally here we have, I think we're competing for the most dysfunctional country award and who falls first. But Maduro is also, in battle well, and, when do you think, he's been trying to cling on to power with all this proposal of constitutional assembly. Does that work as well for him, or do you think he falls first?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it is going to be it's certainly looking like a contest in terms of who goes down first. But our view is that Maduro is also unlikely to remain in power until the end of his term, and that this whole constituent assembly process that he's moving forward with, he's not going to be able to successfully change the rules of the game in order to stay in power over the long term, which is ultimately his goal. So yesterday he announced the details of the Constituent Assembly, and really it's just provided the opposition with an additional rallying cry in the streets. And we've seen now we're nearing 2 months of protests that have been massive throughout the country, and I think that this Constituent Assembly doesn't resolve that problem, and we see now that there's a level of popular frustration, a certain momentum to this protest movement that increasingly feels like it ends with Maduro out. Timing, obviously very difficult to predict, but I think either we see this current crisis escalating, violence and unrest escalating to a point that the military will reevaluate their commitment to Maduro, or you just see this kind of lasting, this persistent unrest that we've seen at this current level over the next several months with, around 7 people dying per week. And that also starts to chip away, I think, at loyalty to Maduro and makes it very hard for him to stay in power.
And what does the transition look like? I mean, who comes after Maduro, and how stable, how strong that government will look like?
No, it's also a good question, but I think any transition, a negotiated transition, is necessarily going to have new elections that the opposition would be very well positioned to win. I should add again that we're happy to take your questions if you do want to chime in here. But the main opposition figures, Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo Lopez, they're all at least twice as popular as Maduro and his vice president, and actually most other figures within Chavismo are even less popular than Maduro himself, which is hard to imagine, but actually true. So in that sense, I think that a transition would lead to a real regime change and an opposition government coming in, but it will be a negotiation. They'll have to provide Chavistas with some guarantees in order to make that transition happen. Obviously, they'll need some support from the military and other key stakeholders within the ruling party. Do countries like Brazil, other countries in the region, or even the U.S., do they play a part in this, either in terms of Maduro falling or the transition itself or new government? No, absolutely. I mean, I think that the regional pressure is one element that's really different about this particular round of protests than what we've seen in the past. And in some ways, we were very critical of the opposition's decision last year to sit down with the government in this Vatican-mediated dialogue, which really cost them a lot of momentum in terms of the streets and their credibility. But at the same time, I think because they went through that process and they tried to sit down and talk, it bought them, I think, more in terms of the regional response, that now regional governments are willing to take a hard line. They see that the government isn't going to negotiate in earnest. And so we do see these efforts moving forward at Mercosur, at the OAS, and regional governments increasingly coming out against the government. Now, I don't think that's enough in and of itself to force regime change, but to the extent that there are certain figures that may already be on the fence, I think it can be a contributing consideration, right, as to whether or not they continue to back Maduro. So we actually have a question from one of our watchers. This comes from Philip capers. What Brazilian 2018 presidential candidate will benefit the most from this crisis?
Well, I think that you have 2018 is going to be, less about left versus right in Brazil and more about old versus new, right? I think new faces, of course, will benefit. I mean, the caveat for Brazil is that Brazil's electoral system it gives a lot of advantages to traditional mainstream parties, meaning it's a continental country, so resources matter, right? You need money, you need TV time in order to run a competitive campaign, and those are given to parties according to their size in Congress. So that means that if the odds of a complete outsider from a small party running a competitive bid are small in Brazil. But that said, last year we had an interesting municipal elections in Brazil with some traditional parties launching new faces, right? The case of São Paulo is interesting, where the PSDB, a traditional party, launching a businessman turned politician, João Doria, as mayor, and he won very strongly in São Paulo. In fact, he could be a name as well. But that's the recipe, I think, for success next year, is a traditional party trying to look at celebrities, business people, or former judges, etc., and try to make that as a competitive bid.
So not Lula's election to lose.
I mean, Lula, we think that he's much less competitive than it seems. I mean, if direct elections happen today, he would be competitive, given the fact that he's leading the polls. But looking to 2018, a year and a half away, there are a lot of legal hurdles. He's being investigated in a number of cases. We think that there's a great chance that he will be legally disqualified to run. But even if he is able to run, there are a lot of political challenges, because even though he's a charismatic leader, there's a great deal of rejection as well to his name. And he's leading the polls because there's simply no other credible alternative as of yet.
So next question comes from Patrick Nogueira. Is it fair to compare the crises in Brazil and Venezuela, given that Brazil is more economically solid?
Well, that's an interesting comparison. I think one thing that we've been flagging about Brazil and the difference between Brazil and not only Venezuela, but maybe a lot of other countries in Latin America, is that, these countries benefited enormously from the commodity boom, right? High oil prices, etc. And of course, there were incentives from Mexico to Argentina for corruption, right? We've seen corruption scandals pop up everywhere. We've done research on this before as well. What sets Brazil apart, I think, in a way, is that why the investigations stuck. I think it's there's a difference of how the legal judicial institutions in Brazil were set up. They're much more autonomous, independent than in these other countries. So this explains a little bit why this crisis in Brazil is being prolonged to this point of basically the political class is unable to contain investigations, and it's a system that's trying to cleanse itself out of this mess. And it's in the longer term a positive process, but in the short term very bumpy road. And I don't know. I think when you look at Venezuela, maybe the fact that it's much more dependent in oil than Brazil is, you answer that.
They're obviously very different crises, right? I think that we're not comparing them side by side. It's more that these are the crises of the moment in the region. But in both cases, you do have presidents who are having an increasingly difficult time remaining in power, and so I think that's why we're discussing them today. Another question we have from Michael Skadden. Given Venezuela's current state, what's the likelihood that regional or international intervention will be necessary to any transition? And will we need a regional coalition to ensure that a transition takes place or stem a humanitarian crisis? And here I think that absolutely. I think when we do have a transition, you will need international, regional actors to act as kind of mediators, guarantors, ensure that this is a smooth transition. And I think more importantly, a new government is going to need a lot of external help in order to unwind the existing framework, both in terms of multilateral support, huge funding from IMF, World Bank, and others, but also bilateral support and some humanitarian aid support for the new government. So I do think that's going to be a very important component. We're going to take one more question here, and then we'll wrap up. This is from Tulio Althoff. What are the advantages and disadvantages to an early election in Brazil?
Well, the disadvantage is basically you're disrespecting the Constitution, right? And that in Latin America and in Brazil in particular, that's a dangerous precedent. If you call for new elections now, you're cutting a presidential term short. You're changing the rules of the game. And what will prevent politicians to do that in the future as well. So it's basically not constitutional, right, to do it. And I don't see any advantage, to be honest, because in 2014 we had elections in Brazil, and that did not solve the crisis. And I think that's something I think that in moments of uncertainty, just follow the letter of the law. That tends to be the least worst scenario there.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be back next week for another edition.
Thank you very much.